Hey everyone, on this episode I have John Couture, who's a baseball coach and sports psychologist. He's also a former mental skills coordinator for the Cleveland Indians of the MLB, and given that he's worked with a lot of professional baseball players, he brings a really unique perspective to the mental side of baseball. Won't spoil too much of it, so roll the intro.
And you're right about the behavioral aspect. That's really what we try to do. I mean, we have to change some of the thoughts of the athletes, but the behaviors are the most important parts.
Yeah. It's almost kind of like the behavior is like an extension of the thoughts, right? That's what you can actually observe, so to say.
And that's what we have to teach them. That's what we literally have to teach the athletes about how their thoughts and emotions affect their actions.
Yeah. And I can imagine it's a little tougher teaching that, or maybe not a little tougher, but you have to take maybe a little bit different viewpoint teaching professional athletes that than maybe young children, right? Because when I'm going through kind of your experience on LinkedIn, you worked with some high-level MLB athletes, and then you've also kind of done some work with kids. So it's funny how you're trying to get to the same goal, but maybe your way you go about it is a bit different.
Progressively, as I've gotten older, the age group of my clients has gotten younger and younger and younger. I think that's because of the trend of athletics in general. Right. And if you talk to a strength and conditioning coach, he'd probably say the same thing, where he used to only work with elite athletes, but now he's kind of working down into high school athletes and even a little bit younger than that, because they know that's important and it's okay to do that. I'm sure 20 years ago it probably wasn't okay for a 12-year-old to go into a weight room and start working out and stuff like that. But now it's considered, no, that's what you should be doing.
Yeah. I always kind of think back to the example. I mean, I'm not a huge college football history buff by any means, so if I get this wrong, I apologize to all the college football buffs, but I think it was Nebraska in the 70s or early 80s where they were the first to adopt like the strength and conditioning program, and they just kind of steamrolled the competition, right? And I always think back, because I guess back then strength and conditioning maybe was only thought of in the pros, but they were really the first to bring it down to the collegiate level, and there is such an advantage. And really in maybe the last 5 or 10 years, personally myself, I've seen a huge shift in like focusing on the mental part of the game for college and youth athletes, right? Like you had mentioned. And one thing that I was really interested in maybe talking to you about was your job with the Cleveland Indians, because being a Blue Jays fan, I have a bit of a soft spot for the Indians because of Mark Shapiro and the former GMs. I'm actually interested in how you even kind of get a job like that with the Cleveland Indians. Did you have to reach out to them? Did they come and find you?
Well, this was back in the day when mental skills and sports psychology was just starting, in terms of like being really open to most teams and most sports and things like that. So no, I was a teacher and a coach at the time. When I got a phone call from somebody within the organization, within the Indians organization, they had known me because I was a baseball coach for an independent professional team in Pennsylvania, and we used to reach out to different organizations to try to basically sell our players to the organizations. So I got a rapport with the organization over that summer, and they knew that I had a background in baseball. They knew I had a background in psychology, and they wanted to start up this position within the organization. They didn't want an academic psychologist to come in there, and they didn't want just a baseball coach to come in there. They wanted someone to kind of have both backgrounds to be able to work with their athletes, to know the ins and outs of the actual game of baseball, because it's a kind of a feel thing. It's kind of tricky to be able to talk to people in a dugout or in a locker room, or know the ins and outs of the travel of a baseball season. So they called me in, and they basically wooed me and said, hey, we think you'd be good for this, and I eventually agreed.
Yeah. I mean, when I think about teams during that time span that needed a mental skills coordinator, Cleveland Indians is probably the top of that list, because just looking through their season by season record, they were a kind of bit of a yo-yo team, right? They had some years where they finished first in their division and some where they finished last. So it kind of just speaks to the need, I guess, of a mental skills coordinator. And it's interesting when I think back of how many teams pre 2000 or pre 1990 that could have benefited from a position like this?
When I joined, there was 4 major league teams or 4 organizations that had sports psychologists or mental skills involved in them. And even the years after I was in there, they treated it more like an orthopedic surgeon, where if someone was having issues, they'd give him the card of some guy down the block, and he'd go see him and stuff like that. So they didn't have anybody on staff. But now, 20 years later, now it's totally different. Now, many affiliates have their own mental skills coach, and they have programs throughout the organization. So it's developed.
What was your kind of day-to-day like as part of the organization? Obviously, I know in season probably a bit different than off season, but what was your typical day-to-day like with the Cleveland Indians?
I get up first thing in the morning and get on the phone, and we used to go through, we had voicemails from all the affiliates, from all the managers and pitching coaches to kind of give an update of what happened the night before. A lot of it was stats, but some of it was information for me, like how guys were performing, how their confidence level was, things like that, how their preparation was, how they reacted to certain situations. So again, I know to young people back in the day, we listened on the phone to voice messages for hours. So in the morning, all of the coordinators in the Cleveland Indians organization would be on the phone listening for hours about information from the night before. And then we would set up our day. Then we'd go to the ballpark at noon or 1 or 2 p.m., depending on where they were. And then I would set up interviews and meetings, one-on-one meetings with individuals. Usually it was the starting pitcher from the night before. We'd have like a plus-minus meeting about his outing, but some other athletes too. And then we'd go through, the whole pregame situation, the whole pregame routine that everybody had. We'd watch the ball game. Sometimes I would meet with guys afterwards, and then start the day over again the next day.
Yeah.
So baseball days are kind of shifted to the evenings, obviously, as you know.
Right.
But the mornings are full with phone calls, basically.
Yeah. What was it like? I mean, I'm just trying to think of myself in some sort of role like that with a professional team, and I would be almost kind of starstruck with high-level athletes when I'm kind of helping them out. It's almost like a surreal moment, because when you look back at the kind of players that the Indians had during that decade, they had Victor Martinez, Jim Thome, Robbie Alomar, and I can go on and on, Cliff Lee, CC Sabathia. So what was it like? What was your mindset, I guess? Or even how much did your mindset change across the 10 years? Because, these are like all-star and future Hall of Famer baseball players, and here you are giving them advice.
It's funny. I was more, if you want to use the word starstruck with the coaches I was working with, because those are the people that I grew up watching, not necessarily the players I was working with, even though they were great players. And you root for them even when they leave. Like CC Sabathia just retired. Like I was rooting for him throughout his whole career because I've known him since he was 18 years old. So the starstruckness with the individual clients, you don't do that. It's not it's not what you're working, because you're just trying to see how good they can be. And again, they're just people just like you and me. Yeah.
Speaking, being starstruck by managers is a valid point too, because they had Terry Francona during that time, if I remember correctly. He was their manager for most of that decade.
Not when I was there, but Terry Francona. But he was an advisor within our organization before he became the manager of the Red Sox. So I did know him before he won the World Series for the Red Sox. Yeah.
And I mean, when I'm thinking about top MLB executives or advisors or coach, whatever he may be, he's probably top 5 in the list, like in the game right now. Like he's just such a polarizing figure, I feel like, in the media and just on the pitch or the dugout.
Sure, yeah. I mean, he's well respected. He's a baseball man, and again, all baseball men they know each other. It's just it's a small fraternity. No matter what city you go to or what really like spring training facility you go to, people will travel just to see certain guys who are part of organizations, just so they can say hi, how you doing, or have dinner with them after the game or something like that.
Yeah. Baseball is one of the. I mean, thinking back about baseball or thinking about baseball in general, for me, it's one of those weird sports in the sense that an all-star hitter or MVP of the year, they only hit maybe 330, 340, right? It's a sport where if you hit 33% of the time, that's considered like extraordinary.
Sure.
And it's a weird, not a weird, but I say maybe it's a not traditional way of thinking, because in most things in life, I feel like we're trying to be perfect. We're trying to hit it 100% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say baseball players aren't doing that, but almost like if they are successful 30 or 35% of the time, that's almost like a win to them. Maybe talk about a little bit of the strategies you use to help players maybe get over, or for having them realize that not hitting the ball every time is still okay. 30 or even maybe for some of them 29 or 28% of the time is still okay. So kind of dealing with those losses, I guess, in a way.
Sure. Well, again, it's some of the most important conversations that I have with an athlete are early on. Again, with baseball players, early on, to understand and get the athlete to understand what they can and what they can't control. Now, it sounds like that's simple. Oh, yeah, I know what I can control and stuff like that. But when you're talking about batting average, it's a big deal because athletes really think they control their batting average, where I have to lay out in sort of a timely manner, like that they don't control their batting average. And they're like, what do you mean? I earned that 300, I earned that 330. Yes, you did. However, because of the play of everybody else on the field, that's why you got 300. It could have been 280 if the guy made the catch, or if the official score called it an error instead of a hit, or you could hit 350 if the guys weren't paying attention in the outfield and the ball fell, things like that. Mm-hmm. So those initial conversations are very important to get the player on my side, so we can actually simplify what to work on. Because you set them up for failure, set them up for frustration if you have a goal about something outside of your control, like batting average, or even hitting a home run. There's so much more to it than just the player's ability to hit the ball 400 feet, in terms of getting a home run. So you have to get the player to understand, and I like use the word simplify what they can and what they can't control, and then it's much easier to deal with the ins and outs of the daily grind of 162 games and things like that. So they don't look to the newspaper or the computer for the stats and to determine if they're doing well or if they're not doing well.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure that applies as well to pitchers, even though pitchers, sure, they might have a little bit more control in their stats per se, because they might have a little bit more control, but I feel like this mentality applies to all baseball players, regardless of position or of course, regardless of level as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Again, pitchers like to use, wins and losses, which they don't use a lot anymore, but they did 20 years ago. And then ERA, once again, there's so much that goes into ERA. Now they have things like WHIP and other stats they look for. But again, there's parts of those stats that are valuable. And the whole stats itself, does a player really no good in terms of like their own performance and what they can control?
Yeah, it kind of seems like, a topic or maybe a concept that I like to talk about that you're kind of touching on here is being process versus outcome focused. So outcome focus is kind of in a baseball would be focused on judging your game, whether or not you had a win or a loss, or you had a low ERA or high batting average, whereas process focused is kind of like, as long as you're doing X, Y, and Z correctly, generally you'll have a pretty good outcome. It might not be every game, of course, because no one can have a perfect game every game, obviously, but if you follow this process, your outcomes are generally going to be, well liked by yourself and your team and everything.
Sure, a hitter can have a perfect game, but go 0 for 4. That's really difficult for a guy this is their life. You know what I mean? They're trying to get paid, they're trying to support their family, stuff like that. If you go 0 for 4, however, someone says, no, you did exactly what you were supposed to do. You hit 4 screaming line drives. They just happened to get caught. It's really difficult for that person, that human being, to combine those two thoughts. I did it perfectly, but yet I failed. How does that work? So yes, that's why the initial conversations with the athlete are really important to understand what they can and can't control. So it's much easier to manage those offers.
Yeah, and I think I read one of the articles that you had shared, and it was talking about what's the most important trait in baseball, I believe, or most biggest predictor of success. And it wasn't talent or kind of anything along that line. It was like the grit or the mental discipline of an athlete, right? Because you can have an athlete that has all the talent in the world, but if they get stuck in their own head at some point during a game or during a season, everything just kind of gets thrown out the window, right?
Sure. Again, I mean, the studies show more and more that at a certain point, talent, gets you so far. I understand that, especially when you're younger, but it's the perseverance. It's the athletes that can continue to show up every day, to show up with confidence, to show up with optimism every day. How hard is that for an athlete to show up with optimism? Like, they're going to learn something new. They're going to have their best day today and stuff like that. Like, it's really difficult every day to do that, but that's what the most successful athletes do.
Yeah, and I don't know too much about the schedule in the youth leagues, how many games they play, but in the MLB they're playing 162 games a season. A player might not play, of course, all 162, but if you're a really good player and the team wants you out there, you're going to play close to 162 games. So it's really hard to stay optimistic and to keep kind of that mindset, I would suppose, of like positivity and perseverance and grit and all that jazz on a 162 game season. It might be easier, for example, in a football schedule where you just have one game a week and some off weeks as well. So you kind of have some time to like mentally decompress, kind of get things back on track and ramp up again for Saturday or Sunday. But for baseball, you don't really have that time off. It's go, go, go.
Yeah. So when you deal with the different sports, you have to kind of manage them a little bit differently, because in a good way, baseball is played every day. So you have the chance to recover quickly. However, it also means that you have to recover quickly because you have another game that day. In football, you have, again, several days to recover and to kind of decompress, like you said, and to evaluate what you did and then to prepare and stuff like that. But some athletes want to get going right away. They want to get over or continue what they did on Sunday and then move on and do it right away before they forget it or before something happens and things like that. So it's a kind of a catch-22 in terms of like the different the different sports and different seasons.
And not only kind of the number of games, but just the length of the game as well. For baseball, it's notoriously known for being a long duration of a sport, right, or of a game where they can get up to 3.5 hours, and it's hard, I would suppose, for an athlete, especially a pitcher, because you're kind of not, when you're on the mound, you're obviously zoned in, but when you're off the mound, you see most pitchers, they like to kind of sit by themselves and kind of stay in their own little bit of a zone. It has to be really, really mentally exhausting. I mean, I'm not a baseball player by any means, but I would suppose it's really mentally exhausting for a baseball player of any position to be involved in a game of that long, any given day. It has to take, I would suppose, a lot of training to kind of get them used to that mindset.
Yeah. Again, you talk about it, the training. They grow up playing the game of baseball, so they understand. But it is difficult. And again, my job, or any person in my role, our job is to make sure that they have those routines. We call them pre-pitch routines. So they don't have to stay locked in 3 hours straight. They just have to stay locked in for 1 or 2 seconds when the play is happening right now. And then they can relax in between plays and in between pitches and stuff like that. So that routine helps them stay up, helps them be able to get ready and again stay confident and optimistic and ready for the next pitch, without this tediousness of staying focused all the time. They have to stay focused all the time. So that routine is very important for baseball players.
Yeah. It kind of sounds like routine is so important for baseball players, which kind of gets me thinking about. I never really thought about it before this, but how they talk about it a bit on broadcast and stuff, but how much kind of rain delays and stuff like that affects a baseball player. They say it throws them out of the routine, or it'll be. I know there's a physical aspect to it as well for pitchers, where if a pitcher's cold for a certain amount of time, it's hard to get them warmed up. But it kind of sounds like mentally they can get cold as well if they spend maybe too much time.
Sure.
Yeah.
Again, we try to tell athletes to make sure they have the routine. I like to use 2 key time frames. What are you doing and where's your mind 1 hour before game time, and where's your mind 5 minutes before game time? So those are kind of two time frames where they really need to stay locked in. Even if they, obviously 45 minutes and half hour before game time, they need to know where their mind is too. But at least those 2 time frames, they are ready to compete. They're doing the best to compete. Now, if there's a rain delay, They're like, okay, well, I don't know when 1 hour before game time is, and I don't know when 5 minutes before game time is going to be. So it does, throw a little bit of a wrench in there. But once again, as you develop your routine and as you feel comfortable and confident with your routine, you can, start it up. Instead of at 6 p.m., you can start it up at 7 or 7:30, whenever, the umpires or the grounds crew says, hey, we're going to start in 45 minutes, guys, or we're going to start in 20 minutes. So that you could start it up. But it's important to have it in kind of master it before those random things happen to you.
Yeah. all these kind of different strategies and routine-based things and whatnot, were they already in place when you came to the Indians in the late 90s? Like, what was the field of sports psychology like 20, 30 years ago? Not to date you too much, but what was yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
There was a lot of trial and error back in the day. But once again, I had a great mentor. His name is Charlie Marr. He's still in Major League Baseball today. He's been in the NBA. He's been in the NFL. He's done wonders with individual athletes and kind of organizations in general. He's worked a lot with Mark Shapiro and some of the administrators with the Blue Jays too.
Yeah.
So, and then over time, we took studies from Olympic athletes and individual athletes, and we just started to incorporate them into organizations and teams and things like that. And then since 1998, since 1999, there's been many more studies. There's lots of PhD candidates out there who do studies and things like that, in terms of what works and what doesn't work. We've done a lot more interviewing of elite athletes and watching them and seeing them and stuff like that to see, if what we used to think worked, does it still work? Does it actually work in terms of their peak performance, and not register and not look at and base our opinions on their statistics, which they can't control, but actually on their performance.
Mm-hmm. What was it like working with Mark Shapiro? And I don't know if you were there when Ross Atkins was there as well with the Indians, but because they're both part of the Blue Jays organizations right now, and being from Toronto, the hometown fans maybe aren't the biggest fans of Atkins and Shapiro sometimes, based on their kind of some of their decisions that they've made, whether fans like to agree with it or not. But when you kind of look at them, they're both definitely big baseball guys, and they know the game inside and out. And I think they have a process to things where they stock up draft prospects, top 100 prospects, whatever it may be, and build up the farm system. What was your impression of the two working with them in the Cleveland Indians? Because I'm sure they were a joy to work around and work with.
Well, obviously they're both really smart guys, and Mark was a few years older than me. He was already well established. I think he was the assistant GM at the time when I came to the Indians. And Ross Atkins was actually a player for us back in the day.
Okay.
Ross decided to retire. He was, I think, a Double-A pitcher. He decided to retire, but we knew he was a quality person. He was a really smart guy, and we kind of convinced him to be part of the player development system. And then he's worked his way up from there. I don't know actually, how he went from the Indians to the Blue Jays, how that courtship happened. But they work well together, Mark and Ross. Even again, Chris Antonetti and some of the other administrators that were still at the Indians, they got along really well. They had the same sort of philosophies and stuff like that in terms of mid-market type of saving money, but going for the wins if you have it, stuff like that. But they have a process in place, and they're following the process. It hasn't always worked, but at least they have a philosophy and a process, and they follow it.
Yeah. So much of kind of sports in general now is on social media. You see a lot of fans on social media, whether they're attacking, the GM or the president or the player itself on Twitter. Social media has become such a huge part of it, which of course social media probably started maybe becoming really mainstream maybe 10 years ago, I would say, like around 2010, 2011. So of course, when you started with the Indians, social media wasn't around.
Correct.
What has been your experience?
We read the newspaper and listened to talk radio. That's
the extent of it. Yeah. How has your job maybe shifted, if at all, with helping players deal with social media these days? Does that come up often with the players you work with?
Yes, a lot. Again, it would be it would be much easier to deal with athletes and to have athletes actually deal with their own careers without social media, like just the phones in general. One of the things we like to tell athletes are, you want to talk about the best performance enhancing action you can do is put down your phone, because it just drains their energy, it drains their time, it keeps them from sleeping, it keeps them from eating properly, it keeps their mind away from being in the moment, things like that. It moves their thoughts to judgments and all these other reactions and things like that. So it's just not good for them in general. It's cool because they can see they have fans, they can see all the other perspective and information out there from the internet, but the social media aspect is just not conducive for their for their own personal development.
It's going to be tough, I think, because I think as the world kind of ages on, more and more of our life is going to be immersed in social media and technology in general, right? So I think it's really important to drive home the point to athletes that don't get sucked into social media and technology if it's not helping you. I think there's some positive aspects to technology that, like, just faster communication, like for example, when you were listening to voicemails for 3 hours in the morning, probably a simple text could have been a lot more efficient, right? So I think there's a good and bad technology, but I agree that sometimes you kind of go on Instagram or Twitter and you see the replies that athletes get if they make a bad play or something, and it's just like one for example that I think of is a couple years ago in the NBA Finals, when J.R. Smith, when the Warriors and Indians were tied at the end of the game 1, and J.R. Smith thought they were up. So he started dribbling the ball out, and then he just got blasted on social media, and it's still a meme to this day. And it's just it's got to be like, I can never put myself in that position unless you're an athlete, but it has to be like extraordinarily like hard to deal with all that criticism, because there's millions and millions of people that are just coming at you.
Yeah, a football player on the New York Giants just got released because of a tweet that he put out. Obviously it was, literally his job got terminated because of social media. One little mistake on social media, and that was So if he wasn't on social media, he'd still be playing for the Giants. Now, obviously, he's happier playing for the team that just picked him up, but still, he lost his job.
I think he got picked up by the Saints, I think it was.
Sure.
Somebody. So they're obviously, for sure. Yeah, it's social media is definitely one of those things that, if you're going to use it right and use it within boundaries. But it's such an easy thing to get sucked into that I think for some players it might be more beneficial for them just to be off of it altogether. But of course it might be on an individual basis. Another thing that I wanted to touch on that I saw you shared recently was the difference between multisport versus single sport athletes, right? Just to read the quote for those. The quote reads, if I had a choice between recruiting 2 players, one played baseball year-round, the other played football in the fall, basketball in the winter, and baseball in the spring, I take the multi-sport athlete every time, all factors considered equal. And that was from Paul Manieri. I'm going to butcher his name, but he looks like he's the coach of LSU or the manager of the LSU Tigers. What was kind of your reasoning for sharing that quote with on your LinkedIn page? Because from me, myself, thinking it from an athlete's perspective, just my perspective, of course, I always not strive, but when I really want to get good at a sport, I try to play that sport every day. And I try not to play other sports because I feel like I'm taking time away from that one sport. I'm not being the best I can be. So this is kind of, something that I never really thought about that other coaches thought of. So what was your kind of reasoning or what are your thoughts on this quote?
It first started when I began working in Major League Baseball. We did a survey of all of the major leaguers at the time. I think they were all the American leaguers, but all the major leaguers at the time. And we asked them, like, what sport did you play in high school or in college? Or, when did you, how many sports did you play? When did you stop playing all the sports? Things like that. And the results came back really fascinating. It was 85% of the major leaguers at the time played more than one sport in high school. And the only time they stopped playing that other sport or the other sports was when they signed their professional contract. When baseball said you're not allowed to play basketball anymore, football anymore, something like that. So that got me to thinking. But also, if developmental psychology, it's really important to get different perspectives on the world, different perspectives on things that are going on around you. So, and then more strength and conditioning data came out and saying, oh, if you work on different movements, then they will help you with certain other movements. So you kind of put all those three things together, and you're like, oh, if somebody does one thing all the time, like the 10,000 hour rule, one thing all the time, you may be able to become a master at that certain skill, but you may not be taking full advantage of everything that your mind has to offer, everything that the rest of your muscles have to offer, and you may actually be a more well-rounded athlete. Besides a person, maybe a better well-rounded athlete for your sport that you're going to focus on for the rest of your life. And then we started doing some other research about 11-year-olds, if they play one sport, do they ever make it to the professionals? Whether it's basketball or baseball or whatever it is. And the answer was really no. Like the odds are against you if you only play one sport before, I think it was like age 14 or 15 or something like that. And then a new book just came out. The name of the book was Range, and it talked about how well-rounded people are if they have more experiences. You're like, okay, that's awesome. Well, what does that make? Why does that make them good in their new job? Well, bosses and heads of big organizations want well-rounded people because they want to be able to have different analogies to certain problems, to problem solving. If you've done one thing your whole life, if you've just thrown a baseball your whole life, you may not know how to attack a new problem that comes up. Like, all of a sudden people are, increasing their launch angles, hitting home runs. How are you going to, manage that? Are you going to fix your arm angle? Are you going to fix, all of a sudden develop a new pitch to kind of counteract that? What are you going to do? So we think that the more well-rounded, or the more the athlete that plays more than one sport is able to react much better, much faster, and has more tools and resources to manage those situations, and in essence become a better baseball player or football player or whatever they are doing at that moment.
Mm-hmm. So it kind of sounds like not only they gain the physical benefit of playing multiple sports, but the mental benefit of it as well. And kind of one thing that that kind of sounds like you're alluding to is kind of like losing at different sports could be beneficial as well. Like like losing at baseball could mean one thing to you, but when you lose at many different sports, and maybe it gives you kind of that different mindset on what losing means. Because there's I guess a hot debate in the media these days about participation trophies and letting all the kids win in some sort of way, not really teaching them to lose, right? And I think losing is such an integral part of being a good athlete, because if you haven't lost your whole life and then you get to a certain stage and you start losing, you might not know how to deal with it. I think nobody wants to lose, but I think it's almost like a necessary evil in a way.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. If you're a coach, like for example, the college coach for LSU, if you know that a person, played basketball in high school, but wasn't the best basketball player, you want to go recruit him and watch him play basketball to see if he has the grit, the perseverance, to see if he shows up every day to basketball practice and try to be the best kid he can be, to try to be the best teammate or the best leader, besides the fact that he has different teammates that he has to, socially be coordinated with. He has a different coaching staff that he has to manage and understand and get information from and stuff like that. So he's bringing with him a whole bunch of positive experiences that, again, may not directly say he's going to be a better pitcher or a better third baseman or whatever, but he's definitely going to be able to handle adversity. He's going to be able to see if he can make the most out of what he has, to see if he could be a really good teammate to a whole wide range of teammates in a whole bunch of situations. Again, maybe his second or third sport, he doesn't start. He's not the MVP, so he sits the bench. So he gets to learn how to manage that situation. So he brings that to the table of a college coach or his first A-ball coach in baseball and stuff like that. Like, that means a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's how do I frame this? As a baseball player, do you think that it matters what second or third sport you play, or it could be maybe any sport?
They're doing studies on that right now. Yeah,
Okay.
they, obviously they've done studies with football players, and they say the football players' best second sport to play is like track and field. Okay, I
Yeah.
understand. They get to know how to run and jump and stuff like that. Yeah, okay. But they haven't quite narrowed down the baseball thing yet. Obviously, I think hockey may be a really good secondary sport to baseball because it's a stick and it's a puck or a ball, stuff like that. So that may be something that can be studied, but that may not be. There may not be a lot of people that do, besides Tom Glavine, that do hockey and baseball, in terms of high school and stuff like that. But they're still working that out. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. One last thing I wanted to touch on, John, just before we sign off here, was the news recently of the MLB commissioner wanting to eliminate minor league systems. And I know a lot of baseball people have come out and saying that's the wrong move, and that minor league systems are so integral to the game and player development. I don't know if you had a chance to review kind of his recommendations and maybe all that kind of stuff, if you had any opinions about whether that was a good move or not, because myself kind of being out from the outside perspective of the game of baseball, I don't know really how to think about it.
Again, I don't want to judge it good or bad. However, there's positives to both. I know as a very limited baseball player myself, if I had the chance to play, single A or double A, even if I wasn't considered one of the prospects for a double A team, I would still be very proud to say, I played double A for the Red Sox or double A for the Blue Jays or whatever, stuff like that. However, the other side of it is there are players, again, these are people that get kind of drawn along where they really have no shot at all of becoming a big leaguer or making lots of money in baseball. They're just what we call organizational players. And once again, there's a benefit to playing 3 or 4 or 5 years in minor league baseball, but there's also a detriment too, meaning they lose time of they lose family time, number one, but they also lose some educational time. They can be going to college and getting their degree or moving on with their life and things like that. There's positives to both sides of it. I do know that those small towns that have the single A clubs or the rookie clubs and stuff like that down south in North Carolina and stuff, they rely on those, whatever it is, 70, 74 home games. I mean, they love those games, so they really look forward to those games all year long. So if those small towns all of a sudden didn't have something to go to and didn't have a source of revenue, didn't have, people like myself, like outsiders go in and get hotel rooms there and buy dinner and breakfast there and stuff like that, they would be hurting from the economic standpoint also. So there's positives to both sides of it.
Yeah, I've been to a couple of Buffalo Bisons games myself, or the AAA affiliate of the Blue Jays, and it's really eye-opening and pleasantly surprising to kind of see the culture around minor league baseball, and it gets, Buffalo, even given that, despite that there's the Sabres in town and the Bills and there's Toronto nearby, there's a lot of major league teams around, they still get a pretty decent turnout for a crowd, especially when, most recently when you have Vladdy Guerrero Jr. there and Bo Bichetti and kind of all the big prospects for the Jays. A lot of people from Canada drove around. But I can only imagine, for those smaller towns, maybe in the States where there's not a lot of pro teams around them, that the minor league teams are basically their major league team, right? Like that's their team they cheer for, and it has that major league feel to it.
Yeah, again, you watch the movie Bull Durham, and there's a lot of those towns out there, that really worship those players. They come in and come out and stuff like that. You have the groupies that hang out outside of the gate and want to get autographs or get pictures, and the girls that are trying to hang out with the guys and stuff like that. Again, there's positives on both sides, and there's also some negatives too. A team doesn't need 6 minor league affiliates to fill a major league roster every year or something like that. But they can probably do it better with their spring training facility. They have things called extended spring training. They have things called Florida Instruction League or Arizona Instruction League, Fall Instruction League, where they can probably get their work in and stuff without having to hit the bushes and go through a whole minor league season in Burlington, North Carolina or something like that. They could probably be more efficient. However, it's really a tradition, and I think that's what keeps it going, is that tradition aspect of it.
Yeah, yeah. So hopefully it kind of sounds like whatever decision they make with the minor league system, that they have as many people involved as possible, make it maybe as much of a pros and cons, weighing the pros and cons, rather than one person kind of ruling what he or she thinks is best. So that's my hope for this all, at least.
They may do it in segments too. Maybe every organization gets rid of one low A team this year, and then maybe a few years later they get rid of one high A team or something like that. So instead of 6 minor league affiliates, they're going to end up with 4 minor league affiliates or something like that.
Yeah. Anyways, John, I got to run right now, but thanks a lot for taking the time this morning. It was really insightful. Myself not really being familiar with the game of baseball, it was really kind of eye-opening and educational to hear about some of the things that go on behind the scene. And it's good to know that the Jays are in good hands with Shapiro and Atkins moving forward. That's always good as well. That's worth the morning wake up.
You lost a good one in Ben Chennington, though. You lost a good one.
Yeah.
The Pirates around.
I know, and even a couple years ago with Double-A Alex Anthopoulos that left, he built that Jays team that made it to the I think they made it to 2 straight ALCSs. Yeah. So we've lost some good GMs over the years, but it's good to hear we're in good hands. Thanks, guys, again for checking out this episode. If you enjoyed any part of it, please share it with your friends and family, and I'll speak to you next time.